All right, guys, so we have some big news that broke today that I want to discuss with you. BNO News here says, and this is from Reuters originally, Russia says invasion will stop in a moment if Ukraine agrees to following demands. Constitutional amendment ruling out membership of any blocs, so that means NATO. That I'm not sure that might mean the EU as well, which apparently Ukraine just signed the application for. Cease military action. We're going to come back to all this in a second and go one by one. Recognize Crimea as Russian, and recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Okay, so let's dive into it. So, constitutional amendment ruling out membership of any blocs like NATO, potentially the EU, basically saying like you cannot fully align with the West. That's the idea. This de facto is already the case. They're obviously not in NATO right now, because if they were in NATO right now, they would have already, deployed NATO troops to defend Ukrainian territory, and that has not happened. Biden has been very thorough and clear in saying, we're not going to send any U.S. troops, we're not going to send any U.S. troops, we're not going to send any U.S. troops. You have Boris Johnson ruled out a no-fly zone. Jen Psaki and Joe Biden ruled out a no-fly zone. Even neocons in the U.S. like Marco Rubio were saying, look, we just can't do a no-fly zone because that's World War III. So this is kind of already the case. Zelensky said before Vladimir Putin invaded that Ukraine joining NATO is ultimately a, quote, dream, and that their bid has, quote, stalled. So the fact of the matter is, they're not in NATO now. They're not going to be in NATO. And for them to say, hey, put it in a constitutional amendment, it's like, okay, but you already sort of won on this one. So to bring it up now seems kind of absurd. Now, the next one is cease military action. This one is actually maybe the most objectionable, because the claim previously from Russia was, you guys have to disarm. So he had the famous lines in his speech about like denazification of Ukraine and disarming Ukraine. And so cease military action, it sounds like they've softened the language. I don't know if that's purely for propaganda purposes. I don't know if that's just in the comments that are made to the West. Meanwhile, domestically, they're saying something else. But cease military action could mean like, let's just stop fighting, which is like, okay, I mean, anybody can and should agree to let's stop fighting. Or it can mean, no, still, we want you to literally disarm and drop your weapons as we attack you, which is the most absurd demand you could ever ask for. You know that's a non-starter. You know nobody's ever going to agree to that. And it's like if somebody comes into your house and holds you at gunpoint and is like, okay, now you're not allowed to defend yourself. Well, then maybe don't invade my house in the first place. Don't break into my house in the first place. So cease military action, a lot depends on what that means, but in many ways this seems like the most objectionable, because it probably does still mean we need you to fully disarm, which is absurd because any foreign nation has the right to defend themselves and their territorial sovereignty. So especially since they're trying to get to Kyiv, which is the capital city. So this one, honestly, is probably the most ridiculous. Now, next one, recognize Crimea as Russian. The thing about this is, and it's similar to the first one that we talked about here, about NATO, it's like already the case. Russia has Crimea. They've had it since like 2014. Now, there's no international recognition at the moment, but it's already the case that Crimea is Russia's. Like that already is the reality on the ground right now. So for them to say, well, you just have to acknowledge that reality, it's like, okay, and even if we do, then what? And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here because I want to get to my ultimate conclusion in a little bit here. The next thing he says is recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. So this one, again, is like half already the case. Because, under the Minsk agreement, these were semi-autonomous regions. So still technically part of Ukraine, but governed in a more autonomous way. And so now I guess what Putin is asking for is like, do the full recognition that they are independent states. But look, of the 4 prongs here, basically 2.5 are already met. So, constitutional amendment ruling out membership of any blocs like NATO. They don't have a constitutional amendment on that front, but they are effectively not in NATO now, and I don't foresee them being in NATO at any point in the near future, or even the distant future, given what Zelensky himself has said. It's stalled, it's a dream. Obviously, there are factions and states within NATO that don't want Ukraine as part of NATO. They're not in NATO now, or else NATO would be coming to defend them right now with boots on the ground, and they're not doing that. So Russia already kind of won on the spirit of this one. Russia already won on the spirit of recognize Crimea as Russian, because it has been Russian effectively since 2014, even though it's not recognized by the international community that way. But they have number one in spirit. They have number three in spirit. They have half of number four in spirit, because they already control these regions. These are already semi-autonomous regions. And again, it's just a matter of, like, you need to say it. That's what they're asking for, but it already kind of is the case. And then the second prong is, if they mean demilitarization, like drop your weapons now, then that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. So ultimately, what do I think is going on here? I think it's just a propaganda play from Putin. I think that's all it is. I think that, and by the way, there is a way to test this too. Like, if the West were to turn around and say, you know what? Okay, we grant you all of it. Now, obviously, the one you literally just can't grant under any circumstances, you have to drop your weapons and totally disarm the country because I say so as I'm invading you. That's insane. That's a non-starter. That's never going to happen. But even just to effectively checkmate Russia, to unmask them and show that what they're doing is not purely defensive and not just about the things that he's claiming here that it's about, if you were to say, you know what? Okay, granted, we got all that done. And then we see what Russia does. And my guess is, they're not just going to withdraw. They're not going to withdraw. If the West said yes to all this, again, barring total demilitarization and disarming as you're getting attacked, that's never going to happen, nor should it. But if the West said yes to the rest of this, I highly doubt Vladimir Putin would just withdraw. And there's also some chatter, by the way, right now, that one of the other asks is that, hey, look, man, we're being reasonable. We're not even saying Zelensky needs to step down as president. But they might be insisting that there's also a pro-Russian head of state as well alongside Zelensky. So they want to make Zelensky a leader who doesn't really have the reins of power, so more of like a figurehead, and they want to have a Russian-aligned prime minister who makes more of the decisions. Now that's just a rumor at this point, but they're saying this might be one of the other asks that's going on behind the scenes, because they're not just saying, hey, Zelensky could stay in office and he still gets to make all the decisions. They're sort of giving in on Zelensky can stay in office, but they want him more as just a figurehead, and they want some pro-Russia-aligned PM with him. So that's another one of those things that's an ask that can just literally never be agreed to. I mean, you can't let an invading country just pick your leader. We would all correctly disagree with that if the U.S. does it. When the U.S. props up puppet dictator governments, we're all like, okay, well, that's immoral and unethical and shouldn't be allowed and is a wanton violation of international law. And we should be saying the same thing if it's Russia that asks for that, or if it's Russia that demands that, or if it's Russia that's putting pressure to get to those ends. So, again, that part is more of a rumor. I don't know for sure if that's something that Russia is asking for, but my guess is, of course, there are stipulations attached to Zelensky can stay in power. I have no doubt that they're not just fully on board with Zelensky staying in power and having all the control. I think they probably want a way to make Ukraine more Russia-aligned, and a way to do that would be some sort of power sharing, or Zelensky being a figurehead and a Russian-aligned prime minister who makes all the decisions. So that's something they can't agree to. They would never agree to. The precedent is like, anybody can invade any country and then demand that a leader represents their interests. That's insane. But that and, like, cease military action, if that indeed means, like, demilitarize, disarm as I attack you, that's never going to happen. But I would almost love to see a situation where, you know, the West says, and the other issue here is, it's not like the United States can just accept the terms of this agreement. It's more about Ukraine and Russia that have to come to the terms of an agreement, right? So almost like even though you're the U.S., you're the superpower, and you have some role in this, it's not like Biden could just step up and say, okay, we accept these terms, now let's see what happens. But I would almost love to see a thought experiment where Biden steps up and says, yeah, we do accept these terms, and we tell the Ukrainian people, like, hey, I know you don't like it, but accept these terms, just to see what would happen next. Because again, my guess is this could be yet another area where you can unmask what Putin is really doing here. Because I keep going back to his speech when he announced the invasion. He admitted in his own words, this is not just about NATO. He admitted that a lot of this has to do with historical claims of Russia to Ukrainian territory and to the Ukrainian people. I mean, he said, look, we built you up. Russia built up Ukraine. We made you. We invested heavily in you. You're in a massive amount of debt to us. And then you turn your back on us and you go align with the West. So it's a very blood and soil speech. The idea is like, you were once ours and you are still rightfully ours, and I will bring about that state of affairs. So it's like an imperialist claim to land that is no longer theirs. And so in the speech, he let everybody know this isn't just about NATO. This isn't purely defensive. This isn't just about I feel under threat from the West or whatever. And so even if the West were to agree to all the terms that within reason they can agree to, I still think that Putin would just move the goalposts. Because here's the other thing. So, okay, if these are the things that you really care about, right? Aside from the insane disarm, demilitarization thing, right? If the rest of these things are the things you really care about, why the hell are you trying to invade Kyiv, the capital city? Why the hell are you invading? Why are you also in the western portion of Ukraine? So if all you were concerned about was like, hey, what about we want Crimea to be ours and we want Donetsk and Luhansk to be independent republics, then why are you invading Kyiv? Why are you in the western portion of the country? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't add up. And then, of course, you guys know I've brought this up a million times now because I think it's an important piece of evidence that everybody overlooks. But they discovered massive amounts of natural gas in western Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and just off the coast of Crimea. Just off the coast of Crimea, they discovered it in 2012, and then it was 2014 that Putin went in there and jacked Crimea and said, this is ours. And then, by the way, also, Ukraine, in response to that, I think poured cement into the fresh water sources that were going into Crimea. Basically, like, making it like, well, Crimea is ours, and if you're not going to let us have our territory, then we're not going to allow you to have it. We're going to ruin it for you however we possibly can. That's basically what happened. But anyway, even if the West were to agree to all these that they can agree to, obviously you can't agree to demilitarize and disarm as you're literally being attacked. That's psychotic. That's insane. Nobody would agree to that. You have to be the biggest cuck in the world to agree to that. And you can't agree to, we'll just let Russia pick somebody who co-shares power with Zelensky. Those things aside, if indeed those are the demands, if you agree to the rest of these, that would be a great test, because my guess is Putin would immediately turn around and, continue doing what he's doing. Doing what he's doing. So I almost would like to see that thought experiment unfold to just see what would actually happen. But we're not going to get to that point because, again, it's not even on like the West or me or anybody else other than the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government to determine whether or not they accept these terms. And my guess is they would say no to most of these. I mean, the NATO thing, like I said, Russia already kind of won on that, but I don't think they do a constitutional amendment for it. Cease military action, if that means disarm, they'd say, go fuck yourself. Recognize Crimea as Russian, even though Russia has control of Crimea and they've had for years and years and years. Zelensky has said over and over, we're not going to give away an inch of Ukrainian land. And Donetsk and Luhansk, same thing. I mean, Russia has control of them, but I don't think they're going to give away that territory, an inch of that territory. So ultimately, what's probably going to happen is a long-term attempted occupation of Ukraine. And again, not just of Crimea, not just of the eastern portions of Ukraine, the Donbass region, but whatever Russia can hold, they will hold because they're invading all these different parts of the country, including the western portion of the country, including trying to move on Kyiv. So my guess is, as of this moment, what it looks like is there's going to be a long-term occupation, which is not good for anybody. And it also sucks because we're going to perpetually be on the brink of World War III because there's going to be a tit-for-tat continually between the international community, the West, and Russia. And then China's now involved on the side of Russia nominally. So it's just really, really not a good situation for anybody. And it's the worst-case scenario, not only for Ukrainian civilians who are really going through it, and my heart goes out to them massively for everything that they have to deal with, but also for innocent Russians who are bearing the brunt of catastrophic sanctions that have been levied on the country. So, I don't know, man. I don't like anything that I'm seeing here. But the craziest thing is, it is possible. So, get this, guys. It is possible. Let's say we're lucky enough to escape World War III, which is genuinely a question mark at this point, right? Like, this thing is already spiraling out of control. It could spiral more out of control. What is possible is that after, say, I don't know, 6-7 years of an occupation, Russia attempting to occupy Ukraine, at the end of all that, when everybody is finally tired of the fighting and the death toll is way too high and Russia is bled dry economically beyond anybody's imagination, at the end of all of that, you may get some sort of a deal on paper, which somewhat matches what we're seeing here. You know, Crimea as officially being Russian, it already is unofficially Russian. Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, at some point they're going to be, you know, even though they're unofficially independent states now, at some point in some far off in the future deal, they might become independent states. NATO, like I said, is not part. Ukraine is not part of NATO. I don't foresee them being part of NATO, no matter how far down the road, because then that would mean immediately jumping into World War III. So what's crazy is that as we sit here and read through this stuff, I feel like right now there's not an appetite for this at all, for any of this stuff at all. But in 6 or 7 years, if we're lucky enough to not spiral out of control and have World War III, after a long-term, prolonged conflict, there might be an appetite among the Ukrainian government and the Russian government for different reasons. Like, okay, let's work out something like this, right? So, and you can make of that whatever you want. You could feel good about that. You could feel bad about that. Whatever. But I do think that's the state of affairs and what is likely to happen over time. But again, when you go through these asks point for point, you find that Russia already has like 2.5 of the 4 asks, right? They already have a majority of what they say they want. So is this really about this? Or does it also have to do with what Putin said the other day in his speech, which is imperial ambitions, which is wanting to reconstitute some semblance of the Russian Empire, which is wanting the natural gas, so on and so forth. So anyway, there's your new news. We're never going to get to see what would happen if the things here that could be agreed to were agreed to. We're never going to see that, but I'd be really interested to see what would happen in a situation like that, because my guess is it wouldn't change much, and it certainly wouldn't immediately lead to the withdrawal by Vladimir Putin of Russian troops. So there you have it. There's your new breakdown, and I'll keep giving you guys updates and trying to stay on top of it as much as possible.